Okay, so welcome everyone. As you see, this is Lars is here. So for anybody who's here, this is well, you know who Lars is, I guess, by this stage, or else you wouldn't be here. So Lars has very, very generously agreed to spend some time talking to us to tell us all about his adventures and how he discovered Lithuanian beer, Lithuanian Farmhouse beer particularly, and where it led him, and basically to give us an overview of what is a very unique brewing culture. Simonas has joined us as well. So Simonas here, I'm going to bring up as well here, is from Dundulis. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Dundulis.
Yeah, Dundulis.
Dundulis. My wife will kill me.
Yes, okay. Hello, everyone.
So he's here. Today, what we're probably going to do is mainly it's going to be Lars talking, giving a presentation, and then we have our panel here. We have Richard and Morris from Black Donkey and Canvas, and Christina is supposed to be joining us. And they'll kind of just be a panel just to have a conversation rather than fire questions at you afterwards. It'll be hopefully more of a conversation and a chat, and we'll see where it leads. For anybody who wants to, you can throw in questions. There's a feed there, there's a Q&A section, but you can put in questions, which makes sure we can get to them. But we're not guaranteeing anything. We're hoping the chat will kind of cover everything, basically. So if it's okay with you, Lars, maybe I'll let you just take off if there's anything you want to say. I'll hand control over to you.
No, I'm good to get started.
Okay, well, here we go. So we'll let you get started and take it at your own leisure.
Yeah. Does everybody see my slides?
I can see them.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I started getting excited about Lithuanian beer a little over 10 years ago. And at that time, when I started writing about it and talking about it, people were kind of, I won't say they were laughing at me, although they were laughing because they were, they felt it was a little weird to get so excited about something they considered very narrow. I think that's changed now, and the people really have come to recognize that Lithuania has something special about it, and that Lithuanian beer actually is a subject worth studying. But that's been a long process. And the way it started for me was, of all things, a Christmas present from my wife. The book on the right there was written by a Danish brewer who wanted to create a kind of uniquely Nordic beer and to use Nordic brewing traditions to do it. And he, in his book, he describes a visit to a Lithuanian brewer. And I was quite struck by this description because this brewer was making his own malts. He was growing his own hops. And he even kept his yeast in a jar in the well. And he also had a brewing process that was really bizarre. So I thought, Lithuania sounds interesting. So there are cheap flights to Vilnius from Oslo. So I basically found a suitable weekend and just went there. And I'd found this bar in a cellar in Vilnius that looked like they had Lithuanian beers and it should be interesting. So I just went down there and up to the counter and I asked the waitress, like, can you recommend me a beer? And she got me this one. And literally this first beer was a mind-blowing experience. Like, I'd never tasted anything like this beer. I was totally shocked. And, being the sort of beer nerd that I am, I of course rushed up to the counter and I tried to ask her, so how did they get this flavor? How did they make this beer? Was it the hops? And she looks at me and she says, what is hops? And I thought, oh shit, this isn't going to work. And the whole experience was basically like that. There were lots of interesting beers, but it was completely impossible to find out anything beyond the names of the beers, basically. So there were a lot of really interesting pubs, like this one, which was tragically torn down last year. Really amazing place. They served me, for example, this beer, Jovaru Alus. which was a baffling experience. Lots of flavors in there that I had never tasted in a beer before. It was phenolic, it was fruity, there were some grainy, strawy flavors that I couldn't figure out where it came from, and something like walnuts. Really just a mystery, the whole thing. And then I had this beer, which didn't taste of raspberry at all, like not even remotely raspberry flavor in it, but kind of astringent and with some of the same weird flavors as the previous beer, but very, very different. And you see the name of the beer, right? So something that kept happening was that I would go into a bar, sit down at a table, look through the menu and decide, okay, I'm going to have this beer. And then I go to the bar, open my mouth, and I realize I don't remember the name of the beer. So you make a snap decision, okay, I'll have this one. You go back to the table, you take out your notebook, and then, oh, I don't remember the name of this one either. It was not an easy beer culture to explore. Let's put it that way. So I actually did several trips to Vilnius and just remained baffled that why were these beers so strange? Like how did they make these beers, and why was it Lithuania and not some other place that had these strange beers? I went to Estonia and I went to Latvia and found nothing like the same sort of beer. And then eventually I discovered that actually Lithuania had a company that did beer tours. And they took me on this whirlwind tour. It was one day driving through eastern part of Lithuania back to Vilnius in one day, visiting 5 breweries on the way. And this really was a beer guide. He had a van with beertourism.lt printed on the side of the van, as he was actually doing these tours commercially. And the very first brewery that we came to was a tiny brew pub. You see the brewer there. He built his own brew kit, and he made, again, beers that were strange. So like he was calling one an ale, but it didn't really taste like any sort of ale that I'd had before. And when I asked him where he learned to brew, it turned out he learned to brew on the internet, just from picking stuff up. So he wasn't, he wasn't like a craft brewer who has learned to brew craft beer. He sort of figured things out from Lithuanian sources. And then we visited this brewery. So what you see here is the brewery, which is in what used to be the barn on this farm. And the reason I considered this guy a farmhouse brewer is not that he's brewing in a barn, but because of this. So this is the brew kit that his grandfather used. So he actually learned how to brew from his father, who also had his own brew kit. And he inherited the yeast, and the whole brewing process and everything about his beer is basically family tradition. And then I visited this brewery called Ualda, and it was the same story. So this brew kit that he's standing in front of here was custom built for this brewery. He learned to brew from his dad, and he was brewing commercially. Yeah, this is also quite interesting. So he had this in the brewery. He had this certificate saying that the government had approved this brewery, and it was dated 1990. And so I said, "Oh, you opened your brewery in 1990?" And he just laughs. No, we became legal in 1990. So he started brewing commercially in the 1980s and sold his beer to neighbors and so on illegally, but using knowledge that was basically transmitted in the family. And this guy, Algimantas, is quite a character. So he wasn't, and when he thought that we weren't drinking fast enough, he would basically stand next to you, take his own glass and just chug all of it down, and then just stare at you saying glug, glug, glug until you did the same thing. So this this became quite a party, let's put it that way. He'd invited some neighbors as well, and we were a good tour group, and it just kind of took off. And of course, this was our 5th brewery that day, so we'd had a good bit of beer already. And the interpreter had taken her 20-year-old son with her, and he was sitting next to me when I took this photo. And I remember around the time that I took this photo, he looked perfectly normal, but the things that he was saying made absolutely no sense at all. It was just blah 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 blah. And I remember thinking that somebody's got to help this guy. And then, you know, it was a party and things happened, and it just slipped my mind. And this photo, you can see my guide with Mantas on the right here, looking at me funnily because I was drunk as a skunk when I took this photo. In fact, the next morning I couldn't remember taking it. And then we go barreling down the road to Panevėžys, where I'm supposed to get off and stay in a hotel. And there's this commotion in the van behind me. And before I know it, I'm wet all the way down my back because this 20-year-old guy has overdone it and vomited, and he didn't manage to get out of the car in time. So I arrive at this hotel clutching a plastic bag with all the bottles that the brewers gave me, reeling drunk and smelling of vomit. And I tried to check in, and I have to explain that it was a brewery tour, and it kind of got a little. And then the woman has to show me the way to the room, so we have to squeeze into an elevator together. That was really, not the highest point of this tour. Let's put it that way. So the next morning, I wake up kind of rotating in bed with this roaring hangover and trying to piece together what I learned. And I realized that a lot of these brewers that I spoke to, they basically had no connection with, you know, the rest of the world when they learned to brew. So 2 of them learned to brew from their families in a tradition that clearly was Lithuanian. They weren't brewing beers like foreign brewers because basically they had no contact with foreign brewing. They had their own tradition for brewing. This was the reason that the beer was so weird. And to explain how things ended up this way, let's take a look at Lithuanian history. So I'll do a 3-minute review of Lithuanian history. It might be maybe a little bit simplified, but you'll get the key points. So Lithuania, as I'm sure you know, is the southernmost of the 3 Baltic states. It's also the largest in terms of population, quite a bit bigger than Latvia and Estonia. And people tend to think of these as, you know, the Baltic states, but they're actually quite different from each other. So in Estonia, people speak a language that's related to Finnish and Hungarian, but not to the other European languages. It's very different, actually. Whereas Latvia and Lithuania both speak Indo-European languages from the Baltic branch, and Lithuanian is a very conservative language. It's kept a lot of the aspects of the original Indo-European language. So if you know a few languages, you can recognize words from Greek and Latin and Russian and so on in Lithuanian. But religiously, Estonia is Protestant, Latvia is Protestant, but Lithuania is Catholic. And what you're seeing here is kind of, in prehistory, Latvia and Lithuania had a lot in common, and then the later course of history kind of tore them apart, and Latvia ended up following a path that was more similar to Estonia. And that's what we're going to look at briefly. So in the 13th century, there was just one small pocket of Europe that was still pagan, and that's the Baltic area here, including what later became Prussia. And there were 2 German orders of warrior monks that were originally parts of the Crusades, but when they someone should mute their microphone because there's some background noise. When basically when they gave up trying to conquer the Holy Land, they needed a new task, and they basically turned their eye to the Baltic, where there were still pagans, and they, from 1200 onwards, conquered what's now Latvia and Estonia and Christianized it. But they couldn't conquer Lithuania. They tried, but they actually failed. They were beaten. And the Lithuanians then sort of realized that they were in trouble, and they modernized their state. And this actually gave them quite considerable power. So they expanded Lithuania to the east and to the south, all the way to the Black Sea. And then they ended up as this giant pagan state in between the warrior monks in the north, Christian Poland to the west, various Russian states to the east, and the Tartars to the south. So they were quite heavily strained, and they got out of this by forming a union with Poland and becoming Christian. So in 1386, Lithuania was the last country in Europe to go Christian. So this, now you see why they ended up like this. So Latvia and Estonia was ruled by these German warrior monks, and later by German elites. So they turned Protestant when the Germans turned Protestant. But Lithuania followed Poland and remained Catholic. And this Polish-Lithuanian union had one crucial flaw. It was an elective monarchy, and the king was elected unanimously. So if a single nobleman refused to recognize the king, he wasn't elected. So this led to a situation where the kings basically gave away more and more power to the nobles in order to get elected. So you got a very, very weak king. You actually ended up in a situation where it was perfectly possible to be at war with the king of Lithuania, but not the nobles. And of course, this was not something that turned out very well. So the end of it was that Poland-Lithuania was partitioned by its neighbors. It was completely wiped off the map. It's quite a unique situation, actually, in European history. So Lithuania ended up in Russia together with the other two Baltic states. And then it basically became kind of a backwater, just sitting there on the edge of the Russian Empire and not being developed very much. And then if we skip forward, it ended up as part of the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, all the breweries were nationalized. So there were 6 recipes that were written in Moscow, and the breweries basically brewed them in rotation. So for a commercial brewery, it made absolutely no difference if you made good or totally undrinkable beer, because the customers never knew which brewery had made it anyway. And the government owned the brewery, so even if you were successful, it mattered nothing to you. So this meant that commercial beer at this time was really poor. But the farmers, they knew how to malt, they knew how to brew, and they were growing grain in North Lithuania. They had absolutely everything they needed to brew. So they did. And in fact, northern Lithuania became this kind of hotspot for getting illegal but good beer. So people traveled from Latvia into Lithuania to buy beers for weddings and so on. And even the Lithuanian Communist Party would, when they had a celebration, they would buy illegal beer from the farmers to serve for themselves. And then, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart, and you got this almost explosion, because you have all these farmers in North Lithuania who almost have businesses already, like we saw with Algimantas from Ualda. And so basically what they do is they just get a government stamp of approval for the business that they already have. And within a few years, there's literally hundreds of breweries in North Lithuania, brewing farmhouse ale in wooden vessels and all of that. And the government doesn't actually like this. So one thing that they do is they enact a law that says it's illegal to brew in wood. You have to brew in steel. And that wiped out a lot of these breweries. But some of them did, like we saw with Ualda, and had commercial brew kits made in steel for them. And then over the next 20 years, this mutates and changes, and some of these farmhouse breweries turn into quite large lager breweries, and they take all sorts of directions. But the Lithuanians basically have spent these 20 years in isolation coming up with their own ideas about what beer should be, basically. So when I came to Lithuania in 2010, the brewing scene looked something like this. So you had large industrial lager breweries, and then what I call the regionals, which is smaller breweries that aren't really small and that do a lot of actually quite innovative stuff. And then micros, some of which are newly started, like Dundulis, and some of which are farmhouse breweries that developed away from farmhouse brewing, basically. And then you have some breweries that they started as farmhouse breweries and they really stick to the tradition and maintain that very strictly. So it's a quite different brewing scene from what you would find in another European country, to put it that way. And these industrial lager breweries, they're actually not all the same. So in the 90s, these were, they were originally nationalized and then they were turned private. And they were in a quite bad position with the Soviet-style equipment and not really very well positioned. And what happened was the foreign brewing groups, they saw this as an opportunity to expand, that you could buy these lager breweries cheaply and then develop them. So that's what they did. Carlsberg snapped up 2 of these, for example. So the Finns got another, and there's Royal Unibrew is also a Danish brewing group. So these breweries are, I would say, quite uninteresting because Schwyteris is part of Carlsberg, and it's kind of noticeable. They have Carlsberg-style training and equipment and make fairly straightforward lagers. But this brewery, Kauno Alus, which is actually in the center of Kaunas, is quite different. And their beers have this taste that I call Lithuanian. It's the flavor that I think comes from commercial Lithuanian malts, which is quite unique and recognizable. So even though most of their beers are just straightforward lagers, they're actually quite interesting. And then we have Birshu Alus, which is another of these industrial lager breweries. They're actually, I would say, a quality lager brewery. They do 90-day maturation, no high gravity brewing or anything like that, and they also do a lot of experiments. So they produce a lot of quite interesting stuff. One of their more notable beers is this one, which is called Shirvenos. What they do is they use 15% of the grist is actually peas, green, fresh peas from farms near the brewery. And when I was there, they told me that this was something they started doing in the Soviet period when you couldn't always get the malt that you needed. And since peas contain starch, you can kind of steal enzymes from the malt and get sugar from the peas as well. And in the unfiltered version, you really can taste the peas, which don't taste like green peas, but it's you can tell that there's definitely something going on here. It's not a normal beer. And then later, with the help of Simonas, I discovered that actually this is not something that they came up with in Soviet times. So farmhouse brewers in Lithuania were actually supplementing their grain with peas. But they didn't use green, fresh peas. They were malting the peas, really germinating the peas and then mashing them and using them to get sugar. I've never tasted a beer made with that sort of pea, so I don't know what that's like. I don't think anyone does that today. Here's another brewery, started by 2 brothers who moved to the Farmhouse Brewing area, learned to brew from their neighbors, and then started out as farmhouse brewers, but turned it into a lager brewery. So they're actually making lagers now. Their flagship beer is called Varniuku. It's a dark lager with caramelized rye. It's really a quite complex beer. Really something I recommend trying. They also have a pale lager called Daujotu, which is it's a very clean and well-made beer, but it's got this Lithuanian malt flavor. If you want to learn to recognize that flavor, I really recommend that beer. It's a good one to start with if you can get hold of it. But then we can get to the farmhouse brewers. So this is the flagship pub of the Piniavos brewery. It looks like kind of a country cottage, but it's in the city, in the center of the city of Panevėžys, and absolutely gorgeous pub, a wonderful place. There you can get 3 beers. One that is kind of a normal farmhouse ale, kaimiškas, and then one that's made with red clover, and one that's made with raspberry. And this is the one that we saw initially. And it turns out the reason it doesn't taste of raspberry is that they're not using the berries. They're using the stems. And that's where the astringency comes from. That's also where the dark color in this beer comes from. So that's, I would say, quite unique. It's a beer made with raspberry canes, raspberry stems. And I was so lucky to get a brewery tour there. Here's the brewer on the right with Montas Perevicius. He's inside this flagship pub when this photo is taken. And you see he's kind of a beefy guy. He's actually an amateur boxer. He's the trainer for the Panevėžys boxing team. So this is the brew kit. And they walked me through it. So on the right is the mash tun. They mash in there, then they move everything to the lauter tun, and then they transfer to the fermenter. They're making raw ale. They're not boiling the wort because it's a farmhouse ale, traditional farmhouse ale made in the traditional way. And then I noticed that there was one piece of kit that they hadn't explained. So I asked, so this thing in the back here, what's that? Oh, that's the hop tea cooker. So they do boil the hops in water to get the bitterness, right? But it was when he said that I realized that you didn't buy this brew kit, did you? Because I mean, nobody sells hop tea cookers, right? And they explained that no, they had drawn the brewery they wanted, and then they got local craftsmen to put together the whole thing for them. So it's really designed around the farmhouse brewing process. And that's when I realized why they were using raspberry stems. So this is a Norwegian photo. This is in a traditional Norwegian beer, this is what you would use as the filter in the bottom of the lauter tun. Alder sticks on the bottom, then juniper, and then straw on top. In Lithuania, it would often be alder sticks with straw. But Vidmantas explained that the tradition in his family was to use raspberry stems. That's why it's in the beer. It was originally the filter. Of course, he doesn't need it with the modern equipment, but it gave him some variation, right? And made him able to brew more than just one beer. So the traditional brewing process would be something like this. You use a kettle, you heat water, pour it on the malt, stir it in, move to the lauter tun where you put straw in the bottom, filter into the fermenter, and then in the meantime, you're boiling hops in a little bit of water, and then just adding that to get the flavor and the bitterness. And so he's really designed this brew kit to just replicate what he used to do in wood when the government forced him to abandon wood, basically. So this, now it's beginning to make sense, right? So why do these beers taste so weird? Well, a lot of them are raw ale, where the wort isn't boiled. And then these people have brew kits built for farmhouse ale, and they use these weird ingredients. You have the Lithuanian malts. In this particular case, Piniavos is using commercial yeast, but as you'll see, some of these brewers also have their own yeast. And when you put all of this together, of course, it's going to be quite unusual and strange flavors. And I want to stress this, that when you come to Piniavos and you drink their beers and you see the brew kit, it's literally everything about the beer is dictated by the family traditions of the brewer. So what this means is that there's almost nothing that you can call product development here, right? The beer that you're making is the beer that grandpa made, period. That's it. You have no choice. You can't change the beer. You're brewing within the tradition. And Lithuanian or Baltic farmhouse ale in general was all raw, unboiled ale. There's 4 white dots here. The top 3 ones are actually Swedish brewers. And you see the one in Western Lithuania, that's in a part of Lithuania that was very close to the German part, which is probably why they are boiling there, or why they used to. And in case you're not familiar with raw ale is not sour because when you mash, you keep the mash at 70+ degrees for over an hour. You're pasteurizing the mash. So you don't actually need to boil to avoid the sourness. And the hop tea solves the problem of getting the isoalpha acids, right? But the important thing, the thing that really matters is that when you don't boil, you keep the protein that coagulates out when you boil. That now remains in the beer, and there's a lot of chemical reactions that happen when you boil that now don't happen. So you're producing a beer that really tastes very different from a boiled beer. It's a whole different category of beer, basically. You get a fuller mouthfeel from the protein, kind of like if you put in oats or you used wheat or something like that. But you also get really unique flavors, and the protein often makes the beer cloudy. So raw ale has been historically a huge part of the world of beer, and even today, my estimate is that half the farmhouse brewers in Europe, they still don't boil. They're still making raw ale. So I would go so far as to say that if you can't recognize the flavor of a raw ale when you taste it, then your education as a beer expert is not complete, basically. And here's another little interesting thing. When you boil, one of the things that happens is that you're destroying the enzymes from the malt. When you don't boil, if you somewhat depending on how you do things, these enzymes can survive. So raw ale brewers tend to mash very warm to compensate for this because their enzymes will keep making sugar, keep breaking down the complex sugars in the fermenter. So Vidmantas Perevicius actually told me that when he began brewing, he didn't know what his mash temperature was because he'd learned to brew traditionally. He knew how to hit the right temperature, but he didn't know what it was. So he started using a thermometer to find out. And he said that any temperature in the 70s will work, he said. And that sounds completely insane until you realize that he's not finished mashing after lautering, right? His mash basically doesn't end until fermentation is done. And I find this very interesting because it's a classic example of where you see a traditional brewer doing something that, he doesn't know he doesn't know what his mash temperature is. Then it turns out his mash temperature is completely insane, and it's very easy to think that this is an uneducated fool that doesn't know what he's doing. And then when you really look into the biochemistry, it turns out, no, you need to do it this way. The tradition and the stuff that he learned is completely correct, even though it seems insane to a modern brewer. So here's another of these farmhouse brewers. Suputa means with foam, and it's the same thing again. That the brewery is in the barn. It was started by Granddad. They're still brewing the way that he did. They even clean their steel brewing vessels with birch infusion because that's what Grandpa did. So in the barn, they have these bunches of birch branches hanging that they use to make this infusion. And they're making a raw ale with hop tea, like Pinhavos, but it tastes very different because they have their own family yeast still. And they also actually still keep some of the superstitions. So when they were mashing, I was told that, no, you can't go into the brewery. There must be complete silence during the mashing, or there will be no foam on the beer. And I tried to make a joke. I said, then it will no longer be suputa with foam, right? And the reaction from the brewer's wife was just stony-faced silence. Like, okay, I will pretend you didn't say this very foolish thing. They just carried on with the tour. Their flagship beer is the one that's called Sinovinis, where they use the family yeast. Their yeast actually makes banana flavor, so it tastes like a very strange Hefeweizen in a way. When it's fresh and in good condition, absolutely fantastic beer, wonderful beer. Really recommend it. It's kind of hard to find though. And then we have Jovarualus, and again, it's the same thing, right? The brewer is Aldona Udriene. She learned to brew from grandpa. She's making raw ale with hop tea. She's brewing in the barn, and she's got her own yeast that she inherited from grandpa, which she pitches at 30C. And this is really quite a beer. It's never the same beer. Like every time you try it, it tastes different. You can recognize that it's Jovarualus, but it's always different. And when you're drinking it, it's a very, very complex beer. You can like see different facets changing with each sip that you take. And this is the one that had the walnut flavor for reasons I am completely unable to explain. It's also a very dry beer because that yeast is diastatic, it turns out. So it's been measured a couple of times, and the final gravity is 1003, 1004, something like that. But it tastes sweet for reasons that are, again, difficult to explain. And it's not thin. Despite being so dry, it's not thin because it's a raw ale. The proteins fill out the mouthfeel. But I think that the dryness is one reason why it becomes so complex and you can taste so many different aspects of it. There's more farmhouse breweries, but I haven't been able to visit them, so I don't know very much about them. And a lot of them are beers that you can't get in Vilnius. One of these is struck out because the brewer died, and that was the end of that brewery, and he was old. How do you get your hands on these beers? You have to go to Lithuania. There's no other way, which means you can't get them right now. We'll come back to this a little bit toward the end. Then let's talk about the yeast for a moment. This is Aldona Udriene with her yeast in this glass. This is the places where we've found traditional farmhouse yeast in Lithuania so far. Simonas has been very helpful here, and he's found several of these. As you can see, it's not a huge number, but it's kind of a strange mix. So several of them are phenolic, but I don't think that all of them are. One is diastatic, but I don't think the others are. And the Jovaru yeast is actually a hybrid. Most of the others seem to be Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but there are other yeasts in some of these cultures as well. So one of them actually contains Brettanomyces, although the beer doesn't taste like what you think of as Brettanomyces at all. And if we compare with Kveik, the Baltic yeasts seem to be very similar, with the difference that they're phenolic and the aromas are a little different. It's usually not the same types of tropical fruit aroma. But this behavior that these yeasts have is basically follows from the way the farmhouse brewers were using their yeasts, and that's why they have similar properties, essentially. The genetics of the Baltic yeast is very poorly studied, but from this paper you can see that the Kveiks are all in the top here, a separate branch of their own. But in the bottom here, you find the number 16 Simonitis. So these yeasts don't seem to be related to quake at all. And it's still an open question whether there is something that we can call a Baltic group of farmhouse yeasts, or whether they're actually different from each other. That's something that's still being studied. Yeah, traditionally, according to Simonas, there were 4 main types of farmhouse ale in Lithuania. So you have this, I call it Kaimiškas 1. That's the one that you can get commercially, which is quite strong, pale, or pale-ish, little hops, quite fruity. But there's also a version that's intensely hoppy. So Julius Simonitis, for example, well-known farmhouse brewer, he makes a very hoppy beer. There's also been smoky farmhouse ale. And then they have what's called Keptinis, which is very different. It's almost black in color and very different flavor-wise. But all of these were raw, as I was saying earlier. And I thought we should look at Keptinis before we finish off, because that's really what I've been talking about so far is obviously unique, but Keptinis is even more unique, if I can put it that way. So Ramunas Shishas that I was talking about initially, he is actually a Keptinis brewer. So what he does is he bakes the mash in an oven. That's kind of what makes it a Keptinis. So Keptinis alus literally means baked beer. That's why it has that name. And when I visited him, I couldn't really figure out what it was he was doing. But I was able to, from a library in Vilnius, get hold of this ethnographic account that explained Keptinis brewing. And I got a Lithuanian friend to translate it for me. So I wrote up this description, published it on my blog, and a British brewer, English brewer, decided to try following the instructions to make a Keptinis. And what he did was he baked all the enzymes out of his malt, and he ended up with black water. You couldn't ferment it. So it was a complete and utter failure. And I realized that basically, an ethnographic description doesn't have temperatures. Quite often, it doesn't have ingredient ratios. So, brewing a beer from that kind of a description quite often isn't possible. I was very happy when Simonas invited me to come to Viconis and actually participate in a real Keptinis brew with a family of farmhouse brewers. So this is the brew house. It's on their family farm. You see Gutautas Janšis is the man who's looking out there. He's actually built an oven specifically so that he can brew Keptinis. And what they do is they start out with the normal mash, just ordinary commercial malts, put on boiling water, and then they stir with this mash paddle. And they keep stirring and they keep stirring and they add water and they go back and forth. And then they pull out the mash paddle, they look at it, stir some more, add some more water, and then they're done. No thermometer. And Simonas explained that what they're doing is when you look at the consistency of the mash as it's dripping off the mash paddle, you can judge how much water you added, what the water to malt ratio is. And the water is 100 degrees. So this actually, if you know what you're doing, this tells you the mash temperature. And I went over after he was satisfied and put my thermometer in and said 67 degrees. Which sounds weird now, right? Because I said raw ale brewers need to mash hot, but you need to watch the next step. So this mashes for an hour. Then they scoop out the mash, put them in steel boxes, and here you see the oven, right? So he's been running a quite heavy fire in this oven, so it's really, really warm. And then he stuffs the mash in there. And this mash is now saccharified, right? So it's full of sugar. And he produces a beer that looks like porter. But you have to remember that the color in porter comes from taking malt and roasting it, right? But you're roasting starch. That's not what he's done. He's toasting sugar. So he's actually making caramel. He gets a completely different flavor from what you have in a porter. In fact, he gets a flavor that I would argue you can't get any other way. It's really a unique type of beer, and it's a whole different kind of black beer, basically. And 3 hours later, when the mash comes out, it looks like this. And now you see what I meant about the caramel, right? You see it on the side here. And there were, for some reason, there were two American guys present at this brewing demonstration, and people were taking pieces of this crust on top and eating it. And one American guy was like, "Oh wow, it tastes of honey. They use honey in the beer here." It's like, no, I saw them make it. There was no honey, but it really did taste of honey. It was quite amazing. I've tried to brew this beer myself with an electric oven 3 times. So far, I've not managed to get the same degree of caramel production that they got. I've tried different temperatures. I tried using hot air. So far, not been completely successful. So next step now, after the baking, is the lautering. So here is the wooden sticks in the bottom. Then they put in the straw. You just chop up this quite hard mash, dump it in, pour on hot water, and out comes a beer that looks like porter, right? But it doesn't taste like it at all. Yeah, this is another special Lithuanian thing. When he was serving us the beer in his cellar, he takes a bucket and he opens the tap, and out comes foam. It's like he's got a whole bucket full of foam, because the Lithuanian tradition is to let the beer build up huge pressure in the cask, so that when you're tapping it, you're really getting foam, and then you have to wait for it to settle out and turn into beer. Hugely impressive beer, like massive caramelly, earthy flavor. Really, really a fantastic beer. And what's interesting is if you look at Baltic brewing processes, it's kind of divided. In Lithuania, you have west central part. It's classic raw ale. In the east, it's all oven based. And Estonia has the same east-west divide, although the border is in a different place. Latvia, we still don't quite know what the geography is. That's work to be done, basically. But yeah, I was going to say earlier that, why does Gutautas mash at 67 when he's baking a raw ale? Because he's baking all the enzymes out of the malt afterwards. Again, it makes sense, right? If you look into the details. But why are people baking the mash in an oven, right? How did they come up with this insane idea in the first place? And while we're at it, why are these people not boiling their wort? And if you look closely on this map, you see green dots in Estonia and in Belarus, which is stone brewers. So what's with the stones? Well, all of this actually comes from the same reason. So what you're looking at here is a copper kettle from the Bronze Age. And you see, this is not the kitchen utensil, right? This doesn't look like your kettles. It's got real impressive decorations and so on. Historically, until surprisingly recently, a copper kettle of some size was a precious object. It was something that cost more money than an ordinary farmer could ever hope to collect. I know this sounds weird, but if you look carefully at older traditions, it shows up very clearly. In Norway, we have a common man's name, which is Kjetil. originally that meant kettle. People were really naming their sons kettle because a kettle was a prestigious and a status object. And in Norse mythology, one of the stories called Hymiskvida, the plot of the story is that Thor and the god of war they're undergoing various trials, and the whole point of the exercise is they're trying to get hold of a big kettle so they can make beer. That's actually what the story is about. So in fact, the absence of kettles has driven the evolution of farmhouse brewing processes. It's all about overcoming the lack of a kettle. And the Russians developed this type of oven, which is called the piechka in Russian, which is a really, really big oven that is multi-purpose. It heats the house, but it's also actually used for cooking. If you look closely in the opening in the middle here, you can actually see cooking utensils sitting inside the oven. So traditional cooking is actually designed for being done in the oven in these pots. And now we're getting there, right? So you have no kettle, right? But you need to heat your mash. And you're really fed up with using hot stones because it takes a lot of firewood and it's quite risky. But you've got this oven, right? So what you do is you just take your mash and you heat it in the oven. Just put piles of not too wet mash inside there and let it heat. And then you take it out and you brew a raw ale. And that's where Captinis comes from originally. You can also use ceramics, right? Heating ceramics with a fire is possible, but it's kind of risky. But with this, it's much easier. So there's actually two types of oven-based beer. One is where the mash is heated in the oven. It's not mashed first and then baked. But the Lithuanians developed it into what I call modern Captinis, which is where you mash first and then you bake the mash to get these flavors. If you look at farmhouse brewing processes distributed in Europe, you see that the yellow dots is a Eastern European thing. You find them way into Russia, up against the border in Finland. And if I had more data, you would see a few dots into Finland as well. But it's really an Eastern thing. It doesn't occur in Western Europe because in Western Europe, you didn't have these ovens. And there's one thing that people tend to get confused about. They see these loaves being baked in an oven when people make Captinis, but Captinis has nothing to do with bread, right? The thing that goes in the oven is the mash, the barley mash. It's got nothing to do with bread. Whereas kvass, called gira in Lithuania, is made from bread. It's not beer at all. It's not mashed, and it's not very alcoholic either. So kvass has bread in it, but it's not a beer. Captinis doesn't have bread in it, but it's baked in an oven. And if you may recall Egyptian and Mesopotamian beers that were made with ovens using some sort of bread, I think that's a separate development. That's also something to be clarified, but it looks like that's a different thing historically. And it's possible to buy Captinis, but it's not necessarily the same thing as the farmhouse Captinis, because you can just picture it yourself, right? Try baking your entire commercial scale mash in the oven. That's not an easy thing to do. And also, it's difficult to get the same flavor with an electric oven, basically. And then there are also Captinis that you can buy that has US-style craft hops in it, which kind of messes things up a bit. Okay, let's try and round this off. So, summarize. Lithuania really does have beers unlike any other country in Europe, and part of the difference is that you can actually go to Vilnius and you can buy real farmhouse ale made according to traditional processes and recipes with traditional yeast and everything. but also more modern beers that the Lithuanians kind of developed for themselves. And Vilnius is a beautiful city. It's not expensive at all. It's really well worth a trip, although I realize nobody can actually go there at the moment. But it will become possible again one day. And then things have changed since 2012. Now suddenly they have craft brewers, which are threatening to squeeze out some of the more traditional brewers. So now suddenly there is IPA and porter and all of this stuff in Vilnius, which they didn't actually have in 2012. So there's, I mean, it's difficult to be to complain the craft beer has come to Lithuania, but it's for people who are excited about the traditional stuff, it can be a problem. And the north of Lithuania is actually an area that people move out of. The capital is in the south, and a lot of Lithuanians come here to Norway because they have better paid work here. So Lithuanians tell me that the countryside in the north is mostly old people and children whose parents are working in Scandinavia. So the traditional brewing is not really doing great. It's still alive, but I'm not sure how it's going to develop. So the slide says go while you can, although of course you can't. So once the chance comes, you should jump at it. That's actually the whole talk. If you want to know more, I can promise you that the book on the left is the best guide to Lithuanian beer in English. That's absolutely certain because it's the only one. The book on the right has more about oven beer and raw ale, but also Norwegian farmhouse ale and stuff like that. That's it.
Okay, I'm going to put the slide there. Thank you, Lars. So that's a huge amount of information to take in. But so just to explain to anybody who's watching who came in a little bit late. So what we have is Lars is here, Simonas from Gutautas brewery, who actually make some traditional beers as well. And to kind of save everyone's time and maybe keep it going, rather than fire questions at Lars, what we have is we have a panel here as well. We have Christina, who's a historian, archaeologist, beer judge, founder of the Ladies Craft Beer Society of Ireland, and I've probably missed about 1,000 other things. We've Richard from Black Donkey, and we've Morris from Canvas Brewery. So they're both brewers who, the idea is they can turn on their microphones now and we'll try and have a chat, basically, which might make it just more interesting than firing questions at Lars all the time. Feel free to ask some questions in the Q&A section there, but hopefully we'll cover a lot of it. So, so what I'd say is, who wants to ask a question? Who wants to say something? Morris, we can't hear you.
Oh, well, I wasn't saying anything, so that's fine.
No, not sorry. We're going to confuse your name. I'll change. Moss, we can't hear you. I was saying Morris.
Okay, I can explain the situation now in what is in Lithuania. During the COVID, some situation changed, and it's on the wrong side because a lot of these farmhouse brewers were shut down, and some brewers like Pinavos brewery, we just switched to like we started to sell the beers in supermarkets. So we started to pasteurize the beer and making more commercial. So it's modernized. So even COVID changes the situation in the beer market. So so the situation is like this. Also, what I can explain, if you want to taste a real farmhouse ales, so you need to go straight to the brewer, because the versions that you will get in Vilnius, they are a bit different, and most brewers they just filtering even the raw ale. They filter this beer through kieselguhr, something like paper filters, and the taste is not the same as in the brewery, what you can get in in local bars like Pinavos or Suputa breweries. So, and it is what my comment for this day. What is the situation?
Okay, so Lars, did you have something there? I mean, you probably have a ton of questions. No, we can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. So, yeah, Richard, you can ask away there yourself.
Well, I suppose my first question is it likely that post-COVID, that Farmhouse Brewery tour that you were on, Lars, is something like that still going to be operational? Was it operational pre-COVID? Is there a sort of, have the farmhouse breweries in any way, shape, or form managed to embrace the tourism potential of something so unique?
Well, the guy that I did my tour with, he actually died a few years ago. But there is a tourism company in Vilnius that's started offering these tours again. So I have never met them. They just started, so I don't know the details, but it looks like that will be possible. But to what extent the farmhouse brewers actually make any money from this tourism is it's a bit of a mystery to me. Maybe Simonas knows more about that.
Currently, I don't know any company which makes it. Was maybe you know, but I don't.
There is. I was in touch with them. They have a website.
Yeah, I've been in touch with one. And on the link, I'll put the link in here if I can find their details again.
Also, you need to check all these breweries, which way makes the tours. Most probably it will be like bigger breweries like Rinkuškės and something, because we like making marketing or something like this. I don't know if they do the tours to the real farmhouse brewer.
I'm not sure either, to be honest. They seem to be quite knowledgeable about beers, but I can't really guarantee anything.
So yeah, so like you're saying that the farmhouse brewer beers are available in Vilnius and presumably Kaunas and Panevėžys and the rest as well. So is there very specific bars, or are they widely available, or can you just go into any pub and pick up one, or are there very specialist ones?
Oh, it's specific places. So the Šnekutis bars, for example, and also a place called Alaus Namai. And there used to be also Bambalina. Now you see the problem, right? Remembering these names is not going to be very easy. But my guide is available as a free PDF, so I guess it's easier to find it there. But you can't just go into any bar. But this is also the trouble, right? That let's say you do go into a random bar. There's one called Akivarai, which is kind of a student pub in a basement.
It's already closed.
Yeah, I bet it is. But if you know what you're doing, you'll recognize that one of the beers is a raw ale. But it doesn't say anywhere. Nobody's going to tell you. You just need to know. So it is kind of a tricky beer market to navigate. But Alaus Namai has a very good English beer menu where they explain what the different beers actually are. So that's really a quite friendly destination. Unfortunately, they have this weird thing that they don't use the names of the breweries. Instead, they refer to the village. If you cross-correlate with my guide, you can figure out which brewery is which.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's completely bizarre. Yeah, that's how it is.
As Lars mentioned before, the craft brewers now is like we take all the part of this market, and it's the farmhouse beers like you can find them in just several bars, and sadly, but yeah, it's even farmhouse brewers are dying, or we are switching, we are making like IPAs or something like that, and so like farmhouse IPAs.
Okay.
So as Lars remember, I just sent him one photo when you can find like IPA. And it's sadly, but yeah, we need to survive, and we make marketing, and we make IPAs, pale ales, and something like that. So
are they seen as kind of old-fashioned, or just something to be embarrassed about, or what? Or is it, that it's just another couple of years and there'll be a huge interest in them, and people will look back and see what they were? Or
oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Some noise.
The thing is that, like, the fact that they're dying out and it's IPAs are kind of becoming more popular, is that people are kind of see them as, old-fashioned beers or from a poorer time or something, that they're just not interested in them? Or
I think it's also on the quality, because the raw ale is very tricky, and when you get it to the Vilnius, it becomes not in becomes weird and something like that, but as I said, and Lars told that if you want to taste the farmhouse ales, so you need to go to the brewery, straight to the brewery. And I think like Jovaru, the brewery, and Czyżew, we are like these wolves, which conservatives, we are conservative, and we still brew the farmhouse ales. Other brewers are switching to more craft beer scene, and so it's like some of these farmhouse breweries are dying or switching to craft beer scene.
right.
And do you think the switch to craft is that driven by the consumers wanting what they think is available overseas? They're wanting the latest, newest, most exotic thing.
Yeah, craft beer is cool, right? It's the same thing here, and it's also the same thing there. So, to some extent, yes.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I was wondering. I could see that they'll just start to kind of understand the value of it just when it's too late or something.
Yeah, that's kind of, and that was one of my motivations for publishing that guide, actually, for in the hope that Lithuanians would kind of get some help to see this the way it looks from the outside. I don't know how much it's worked, but it was very pleasing to see the guide on display in Vilnius airport. So apparently has been noticed at least a little bit. Maybe, but I don't know if there's any real sign of a change in attitude. Do you see that, Simonas?
I think there is another way to encourage the brewers to brew farmhouse ales is like export scene, and it's like you can find some craft breweries where you are making like something common to with farmhouse ales, something similar to this. But the problem is that this farmhouse ales, real farmhouse ales, are very local, and these beers are not great in shelf time, and this is the main problem. Why? And as you said, all the North Lithuania is like dying out, no population there. So these breweries they losing the clients in local clients. That is another problem. But we're talking about only these commercial breweries, but actually, after our government increased the taxes on beer, so local people started to brew their own BS. So the real farmhouse ales are like we still alive, and we are increasing the number of these farmhouse brewers, real farmhouse brewers.
But
so
not commercial.
This is not not commercial. Just for it's like legal to brew for ourselves in Lithuania. So there is a lot of brewers in Lithuania, local, not commercial. We brew for themselves, and so
Real farmhouse brewing is or was home brewing, just in a different tradition, right? That's why Simonas made the distinction that if you're a real farmhouse brewer, you're brewing for your own household.
Yeah, because all these commercial brewers, they have something that differs from these real farmhouse brewers, because you know it's forbidden to brew in wood. So this is the great difference, because the beer which is brewed in wood tastes different. It has this taste of the wood and something. So, but it's hard to get these local farmhouse brew taste in these beers. You need to know someone who will get you to this guy who brews.
That's a secret. So yeah, the wood there. Lars, you said that you banned brewing with wood, or banned with.
Yeah, it's banned, but now we are changing the situation. We are talking with the government, and now it's allowed if you have a heritage sign. So I think it will be possible now to brew in a wood.
And is that just purely for some sort of sanitary health? Why did they ban it?
Yeah, you need to have these heritage signs and something like this, and now then you can brew it.
Okay.
Probably some microbiologist who works for the government decided that sanitary standards and all this kind of stuff. They did the same thing to the cheese industry in Italy, where they tried to outlaw the use of wood in cheese making, and it didn't go down very well, so they had to reverse it. I don't know in what the status was in Lithuania, but it's the kind of thing that the EU comes up with because they got nothing better to do.
This was before they joined the EU, but as I understand it, the government isn't necessarily, or wasn't necessarily, very supportive of small brewers, and would rather see big commercial ones.
They forbid to brew in wooden vessels when these large breweries came to the Lithuanian scene, like Carlsberg and so on, because there were so many breweries in Lithuania, maybe up to 100, and they brew locally, and it was hard to get into the scene even for these large breweries.
They just lobby.
So we just find the way how to shut these small breweries. So we just forbid to brew in wood, because all these breweries were brewing in the wood in the 90s.
Yeah.
And it was too big investment to change to the steel, all the equipment. So after this, lot of breweries shut down in Lithuania.
Okay. Yeah, so it's just purely commercial, monopolistic decision.
Mm-hmm.
Zina, did you have
I have lots of questions. So actually, Lars, I was reading your book, rereading it, and it's really interesting. So I have some historical questions, if that's okay.
Great.
So I was particularly interested. You talk about old folk songs and how they talk about beer. In particular, they talk about hop growing. And I was really struck by that, and I wondered how long historically hops had been added to Lithuanian beer, or do we even know that? Just given that the prevalence of ale over hopped beer in a lot of places for a lot of period of time. I was just really struck by that when I was reading.
Well, I think the kind of history of hops that's become accepted is, it's mostly based on documentary evidence, which is not where you actually find the evidence. So we know hops have been used in beers at least since the 7th century in Germany. And in Russia, there was actually a huge hop trade already in the 15th century. So it seems like Britain was really very, very late to the party, if I can put it that way. But I don't think anybody knows when the Lithuanians actually started using hops. Do you, Simonas?
And as archaeological evidences in 13th century, there is found some seeds of the hops in some archaeological area. Also we have some in 16th century we have huge export of the hops to the western, to the Germany maybe, or something, to even maybe to England, because there was even law, if you will just if you ruin the hop yard, so you have a punishment for or fine for this. And so so in 16th century it's evidence that it was huge hop yards in Lithuania. So we can tell what for sure in 16th century there was hop yards, and the hops were growing for some purpose, for commercial or for brewing. Also there is evidence with Kiev, Russia, and this birch notes, where was written also in 13th century what some if you know, Lithuania was large in that time. It was till the
Black Sea.
These in Novgorod belonged in some part of to Lithuania. We paid taxes to Lithuania. So we also were written that we will buy their hops and will brew a beer. So we can say what in maybe it was used, but the hops in the beer in 13th, 14th century in that part. And
maybe also before, right? You don't know that it wasn't.
Yeah. It's hard to tell it, but because we need to do investigation.
Presence of hops, were they used in this? Were they used as medicine? Very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question with that. Is Lars, in your book, you talked about dark beer being considered sacred, similar to altar wine, and I just wanted to hear a bit more about that.
I don't know anything more. Ramuna Shisha said that, but I don't know what was behind it. I've never been able to find out. Do you have any ideas, Simonas?
I don't know. Actually, it's regarding maybe Captinis, but it was I was reading that till the 19th century, all the beer was Captinis in Lithuania, not in Lithuania, in that north part of Lithuania, and the people told that I have found some evidence that the Captinis beer was the main beer, and modern beer was other beer, like not Captinis. So in the 19th century, it says that in 19th century it was all the beer was like Captinis. But the secret, I don't know what is the secret. Maybe it's like old beer. Like that.
Yeah, I was thinking that too, because beer in general was seen as sacred. So that might be a better explanation, actually.
Yeah, do you think the fact that Lithuania stayed pagan till the last country in Europe, has that had any effect on the type of beer, or would that just be?
not being a pagans, but being conservative, because we have like Lithuania is the center of the two cultures, of Western culture and Eastern culture, like Slavic and German. It's like clash of these cultures, the center of it. And we have, even in Lithuania, we have like more Western culture in Western Lithuania and Eastern culture in Eastern Lithuania. So this part in Easter, we have more conservative, and even the houses, all the things are more ancient. So I think that is why Keptinis was survived in that part of Lithuania, because it's more ancient version of a beer.
I think this conservatism is a good answer. If you look at a map of, say, when the Black Plague hit different parts of Europe, you can see that Norway is one of the last, and Lithuania and the Baltics is even later. And then it's the same with Christianity as well. It's a fairly isolated part of Europe in some ways.
Also, we have like Soviet times, and there was nothing good in that times. So if you want to make something good, so you need to do it by yourself. So where people were breaking their bread, even making their beer, because if you wanted to make a quality things and eat something quality, so you needed to make it yourself. So that is why all these brewing tradition survived during the Soviet times.
Yeah, I think, Lars, you were mentioning as well that basically, yeah, like the Estonia and Latvia kind of had a lot more, somehow, or like Lithuania managed to keep its independence within the Soviet Union to some extent.
Yeah, that's true. The Lithuanians really fought quite heavy guerrilla war against the Soviets, and then afterwards they also managed to remain more independent. But there is actually traditional brewing in both Latvia and Estonia still. It's just much harder to, particularly in Latvia, it's very hard to get close to it.
Latvia and Estonia were more like of the Western culture, because if it was like these crusades were occupied Latvia and Estonia, and they've spread the Western culture to that region, and all later all the economics and were more Western orientated, more Western, and all these like monetary things and everything, they started to buy the beer, not to brew by themselves. And so, and in Lithuania we were more agraric country, and so that is why the beer tradition survived.
Actually, if you look at Russian history, one thing that's kind of puzzling at first is there's a lot of famous Russians who are Germans, like, you know, Eisenstein, the film director, a lot of the explorers. And what happened was this German elite in Latvia and Estonia, where that was the most the part of the Russian Empire that had the most education. So they were kind of suppliers of highly educated people to the rest of the empire. So as Simonas says, they were really in a quite different position.
So I just seeing a question here about second, let me find it here. Yeah, about the grains that are used. Is it mainly like what kind of grains are typical in Lithuanian beers? Is it mainly barley? Is it?
Yeah.
Is there, and peas, of course?
But there is actually this paper that I showed by Juozas Petrulis. It actually says that in the Keptinis they would use what in English is called bromus. It's actually a weed that grows in the grain field, and You can talk more about this, Simonas, that they were using other things as well.
Yeah. So actually, the Kiptinis survived in that area where the soil was not so like in good quality, and the people used for the beer, for Kiptinis beer, they used not very good quality grains. Like say we used these grains for the bread, but low quality like brome they used we're mixing the grains. So that's why we used even peas and other like wheat, rye. It was very common to use rye for Kiptinis.
Which of course tastes mostly of the process anyway, whereas the raw ale really tastes a lot of the malt that you use. So it kind of makes sense.
Yes, and in that part and in that southeast, northeastern part of Lithuania, where Kiptinis tradition survived, we even used like herbs for brews. Not always we get the hops, so we used like yarrow or other herbs which I don't know the names in English. So it's not. No, brome looks like very similar to the small rye or to the small wheat.
Yeah, you can see in Wikipedia here. There's a photo. Yeah,
it's a grass, like grass, and it. Yeah, actually you get all this brome, then you like separate the grains from the other weeds, so you get at the bottom all these seeds of the brome. As I also do like experiments, I'm growing the barley and growing my hops, so like reconstruction of this process that we're in. So I found that the brome you get it, then you separate the grains from all other weeds, so you get it. So maybe people used to we didn't throw these seeds away. We used to make a Kiptinis beer.
And
not a waste, yeah.
Yep.
And actually, some Swedish guy also now is growing this brome, and he is baking a bread from this, and he wants to reconstruct that and to make this wheat like popular in making a bread and making a beer. Because I think even in Scandinavia it was used for baking bread, and because
in Scandinavia people mostly grew oats and barley and rye, and so the traditional Norwegian bread was very thin, crisp bread, wafer thin crisp bread. But the Swedes had that, and they had rye bread, and they also had what they call crisp bread, which is a little thicker, often made from rye and leaven. So they had more complicated bread traditions than what Norway had. But wheat, basically, which is what you need for real bread, wasn't grown in Norway or Sweden almost at all, because it's too far north, basically.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in your book, if I remember right, that mainly, that all the good stuff was kept for bread, and there was only what was left over was what you'd make your beer from, because you couldn't get the same nourishment or whatever out of it.
Well, that's been there's been a few different approaches to that. So some places, they would, when you harvested, you would sort the grain, and the best grain would be for seed and for malt. But other places, they didn't care so much about that. So that's that's actually a little complicated how that was. Well, and it might be, as Simonas was kind of implying, if your beer tastes very much from the process, like with Captines, it might not matter so much what sort of grain you use to make it. Whereas with another brewing process, the flavor of the grain might come through much more, and then you would be more careful. But I haven't looked at that systematically if the same pattern holds other places than in Lithuania.
Yeah, but actually, even the beer was like part of the food, not like in Lithuania. It was like that is why the beer was raw, because these proteins, this is like a food, and many old brewers, they just say, "What if you will boil the beer, we will lose the food in it." So it's very strange for us now, because we use like the beer just for fun, not for entertainment, not for. But at that times it was a part of a diet
Diet.
Diet.
Yeah. Which it never was in Norway, because we didn't have enough grain for that. So it was strictly for celebration, and the Norwegian view was that when you brewed, you took the food away from people. So we actually brewed, like, in Norway it's normal to brew once or twice a year, no more.
Yeah, in north of Lithuania, you brew the beer when you end the beer. So you always have beer in the cellar.
Yeah.
So you'd be
Which was the same in Denmark and the same in Sweden, but not in Norway.
Okay. So you'd be brewing kind of constantly every couple of weeks, and
it's not a couple of weeks, because there is farmhouse brewers. The batch of the beer, it's like 100 or 200 liters. So we brew maybe every second month, or if we have like field works, it's very similar to like saison beers. Like you brew the bigger batches for field works, and you need to keep it to treat your workers in the fields. So it's very similar to that. So, because
and generally speaking, Lithuanian traditional brewing is all with malted grains. There's no raw grains used.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, all the grains were like malted, and even the pieces, there is sources of like rules how to malt the grains, and they explain that you need to malt the peas separately, because they sprouts more early, and so I think all the grains were malted. And
in Finland, there were parts of the country where they didn't malt all the grain, but that's the only place I've ever heard of that.
And the brewing processes, if you ask the brewer, how do you start to brew the beer? So he will tell you, you need to make a malt. Yes.
Yep. That's the same everywhere. Like, all descriptions of brewing start with the malting.
Yeah.
Because of course, you're a farmhouse brewer, you're using your own grain, so that's the first step, obviously.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Can you hear us? Can you hear me now, guys?
We can now, yes.
There's a very interesting, there's the same tradition of when you were trashing the grain here in Ireland, that you needed to have a barrel of beer. And when you were talking about pouring the beer with lots of foam, that's a local publican. He can remember he used to pour the beer, and he said he had 2 buckets. You fill one bucket with beer, and it's all foam. And then the one that you've poured previously, you can pour into people's glasses. And then you refill that one, and your first bucket is ready. Now you can pour it into the glasses for the customers. So those traditions of the farmhouse and the festival of when you're harvesting or when you're trashing the grain. That was it's in living memory here.
I tried to find documentation of Irish farmhouse brewing. There was a Museum of Rural Life put a lot of archive material on the internet, and I tried to go through that, but I never found anything like any descriptions, or I know there was farmhouse brewing, but I haven't been able to find any descriptions of it.
There was brewing there's a local monastery here, and an archaeologist did a dig on it, and they dug up the malt kilns, right. But this is back to Christina will probably school me on this, but this is back early generations, as in this is 10th century, 11th century in Lara. But they had very specific kilns. They had one kiln for the wheat and one kiln for the barley, for drying the malt basically and the grain. And they were using sweet gale and they were using different herbs.
Right.
And were the kilns different designs or the same design?
Same design, but apparently they found, with the barley, they didn't find any weed seeds, but with the wheat, they found lots of weed seeds. And apparently, the monasteries wrote lots of rules around malt, and wheat was of the same value as malt, but raw barley didn't have the same value, basically. So that was how they added value to the barley.
Yeah, they had really strong hierarchical standards for different grains and different malts. With the lowest being peas, which I'm actually fascinated about pea beer, because peas and beans were sort of the lowest level of grain, and so you could possibly speculate that they might have been added into brews with the lowest level. But yeah, absolutely, very, very hierarchical about what sort of grains went to what sort of social class and how they aligned, and how that actually translated into lived reality is something different. As we all know, written sources can be prescriptive rather than reflective of lived reality. But it is really interesting, and specifically about monastic communities in Ireland, we do have really elaborate grain bills with 4 different grains and that sorts of thing into the medieval period. So it's really interesting, actually.
This was news to me. Thanks.
And actually, on that, I wanted to ask how far back do we know that pea beer was being made in Lithuania, or do we know that, or what is sort of one of the earliest sources?
For the beer we have like in 1936, I think, the one historian, he was like made like like asked the brewers, and
he made a survey. Yeah,
made the survey, and this Vaitiekūnas, and it was like all the people said that when we make a beer, we use up to, I don't remember, 10 or 5% of the piece. So it was like, the evidence was like, but it was till the Second World War. But I don't know what in previous times what situation was. But actually, it was also the rule to add this piece to increase the foam, to make it more thicker, and because I think the piece also could make when we started to use also the sugar in the beer, because to lower the body of the beer, but to keep the foam of the beer steady. So maybe that was the reason why we put it the piece. I don't know, but I have that like evidence that they put the peace in the beer till the Second World War, just from one source, from Vaitiekūnas.
Maybe just quickly, Lars, because it's you, the yeasts. How different are the yeasts in Lithuania, or how close are they to other yeasts?
Can you repeat? Sorry.
I'm just thinking about the yeast, because I know you mentioned one specific yeast you got from somewhere, and it was like nothing else in the world or something. It was totally unique. So I'm just wondering how unique the yeasts are in Lithuania.
Well, the Jovaru yeast is definitely very unique. This hybrid that's diastatic. We don't know as much about this as we should. Basically, it's been a very slow process to get the genetic research done. But my impression is that it definitely is unique, and that there's more than one kind of yeast. So in Norway we have the kveik, and all of the from Western Norway, all of the yeasts are one family. But the Lithuanian picture looks more complicated, and I don't know why. This is something that I really hope we can get more research on in the near future.
Yeah, but also we have a situation that we had like commercial breweries in from the 16th century, and most of these commercial breweries were like German-like, and all these farmhouse brewers, they just like stole or collected the yeast. It's probably we could collect the yeast from these breweries. That is why the Simonas yeast is more like German-like yeast. And for example, Jovaru, they are very different from Simonas yeast, and maybe we made their own yeast we just found somewhere on the fruits or something like that. I don't know.
Well, I think the reason the Simonas yeast is related to continental yeast is the same as why the kveik is, right? That people were really very careful to have good yeast and to choose the best yeast. So the same families of yeasts seem to have spread all over Europe, basically. I mean, even to Western Norway, which is quite spectacular when you think about it.
Yeah, but we have in Lithuania like the hops, and the people, if you ask where you get these hops, the rhizomes of these hops, they said we stole from the brewery hop yard. So probably it was also we stole the yeast also, or just collected, or the brewer gave them. Because even now the farmhouse brewers, they intend to use the commercial yeast because they are cleaner in taste and more like smooth taste and so forth. So a lot of these even brewers from Biržai, from north of Lithuania, so they tend to use commercial yeast, and because we say all the yeast tastes a bit weird. So I think these Lithuanian yeast were two types. Maybe one of these yeast are collected from the brewers and like kept for a while. From the 16th century, some mutations happened during that time, and our source of these yeast are local. So that is why it's some so different yeast in Lithuania.
Okay.
This is just my opinion.
Yeah, so I mean, we're kind of testing your generosity of time here, but and I know next week you're all agreeing to give your time up again and actually talk about specific beer types, which hopefully we'll get. But Where do you see this, like Lithuanian beers? Can they influence, or can little parts of it influence craft beer, as we call it, like the kind of modern? Where could influences come in, or how can it be adapted?
I think it bloody well should inform craft brewing. I mean, there's no good reason why craft brewers can't play with techniques like raw ale or captinis or other aspects of traditional brewing. So, I mean, you don't have to be born in North Lithuania to not boil the wort. Let's put it that way. Maybe you have something to add, Simonas.
Yeah, if you want to be a real craft brewer, so you need to make to have to show your techniques, not only ingredients. So that is why the farmhouse brews will be popular, I think. That is now happening in the United States, and because if you want to show that you are small and you are a real craft brewer, so you need to show your techniques, not the ingredients.
Yeah, throw away your thermometer and your hydrometer.
Yeah.
Then you're a real craft brewer.
And just do it. I suppose it would all just have to be small batch and pretend. This is really
come visit us in North Tipperary and you'll see that.
Okay.
Okay. Listen, does anybody else have any questions or anything? Because we're testing people's generosity here on their time.
I had an interesting one on, do you expect a canvas doing a captinas? That an archaeologist actually was also mentioning that in Ireland there was a tradition of tortine, which are little mold cakes, which as far as I go back, I've made a few actually for a beer, but as far back, it seems it nearly goes back as far as Babylonia and Egypt, that you have two different styles of making beer, one with a mash basically and the other one which making mold cakes. Which it's very impressive because these little mold cakes, once you dry them, you can keep them for quite a while. They store quite well.
So you're saying that was traditional here as well?
Yeah, that they have an Irish word. Christina might know more. I don't. This is secondhand information from someone who knows more about this. But I remember the word tortine is the Irish word for a mold cake, apparently in Old Irish.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, we have in the old sources, the old Irish Brehon laws. There's 3 tests for malt, and one of them is Catherine Sims argues after you make a small malt cake and you test it for health, which is digestibility and those sorts of things.
Interesting.
So in Lithuania, the captinis mostly was brewed by women, and those women was like they brewed that beer even for funerals. So you never know when someone will die. So that these women just made breads from the malt, and we kept for a while, for such a event. So it also was tradition to keep these loaves of the mash for that reason.
So it wasn't.
That's actually known from Norway in a different way. That people would it's known that old people would prepare the malt for their own funeral beer. Actually, so there's even a quote from one older man who said, he was so happy with the malts that he'd made that he said, "They will not be putting me in the ground with shame." I have a real funeral beer. But I interrupted somebody. Sorry.
No, I was just amazed at that because I had the impression that the captinis, that the baking of the malt was always fresh. That was just, I suppose you never said it. I just got the impression that it had always been fresh just before they brewed. I didn't realize they kept it.
This, if you, Lars maybe knows this, Onute from Južintai, that woman brewer. So she told me about this, and but she sometimes makes loaves and dries it to for some reason. Now she's also smuggling and making a beer for local people. So she's kind of commercial brewer, and so she has some tricks to make Captainis beer. So one of these is to make more breads and to bake more breads and to keep it for next batch.
And she has an old, like the old Russian type oven that you showed.
Yeah.
Used to be in all the old.
So
houses.
if you want, also the Captainis tradition is dying out because all these ovens is very expensive to build in our nowadays.
I presume those ovens would have been wood-fired, presumably, rather than coal-fired.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Did they impart any smokiness to the Captainis?
No.
No.
I never
Too
said
hot.
so.
I don't know. No. It's because you need to clean everything. There is no there is a chimney, and all the smokes goes out, and you need to burn out everything, and all these like stones were heated, and all the like high temperature is just from these stones, not from the direct.
Okay.
Yeah. These ovens are actually very impressive because when you fire it, you are heating this huge brick structure that's really extracting all the heat from the wood. And what I'm told is that if you have one of these ovens when it's like really cold, say -30, you heat it like twice a week maybe. That's all you need because it will really store the heat for a long time.
And
which is actually one reason why it doesn't work very well in Norway, because if you do that, then whoop, the weather will change and suddenly it will be +5 outside and you have to open the windows because your oven is going to stay hot for another 2 days.
Okay, well,
I was thinking about the tradition and the farmhouse tradition in Ireland, and what's really interesting is when you can hear about this tradition of living people who are brewing it. And as in, if there is an evidence of brewing in Ireland from back in the day, I haven't met a farmhouse brewer, but I think poaching definitely has survived. Now that's illicit, so it's hard to get anyone on record saying or explaining how it's made, but it might be an interesting different thought.
Right. Listen, everybody, we've been nearly 2 hours now, so I just really appreciate everyone's time, especially Simonas and Lars. I mean, you've been very generous, and we're going to see you next week again. So, look, Moss managed to come on for the last second. He's pulled up on camera. So next week, same time, we're going to have, and Simonas is going to be kind of leading this, but it's going to be getting more into the technicalities that we were just touching on there, and how the different changes, how it tastes the beer, and just into the more technicalities of it. So I suppose
I hope the beer will reach you.
We hope so. No, we'll be there. But yeah, he's very generous, and for anybody who knows, Dundulis do make a lot of craft beers. Unfortunately for Simonas, you don't actually seem to sell them to Ireland on your website.
Okay, we'll check.
So just in case anybody next week gets very thirsty looking at it, you might want to be prepared.
Yeah.
So we'll see next week around the same time. If anybody else at the end of this, if you don't close your tab, you can exit the session and you can continue talking. There's a lounge area there with tables, so anybody who wants to talk just can continue talking. In the meantime, I'll just play out a little thing and say thank you to Lars, Simonas, Christina, Richard, and Moss. And it was very enjoyable, very, I think, full of information. I think everybody will agree. So we'll see you next week, hopefully. All going well.